afternoon. Welcome to American Democracy. I would like to start by saying Roberto Unger and I would like to have this to be not just a monologue of the two of us, but to have a discussion and conversation as much as possible. The goal is to acquire a better understanding of the United States from its origins to the present. And we will start with framing it by our methodology is really one of American studies, which combines history and literature as well as law and culture and politics as a way to better understand the United States. Many of you know this, some of you don't, that the very discipline of American studies was founded, established initially at Harvard because in the mid-19th century, or mid-20th century, American scholarship was seen as inferior to that of Europe. That if the great civilizations were England or France or European, and because the United Europe still saw, from an educational standpoint, Americans as a kind of post-colonial society. And the upshot is, in English departments and history departments for most of the first half of the 20th century, what you read was European history, what you read was British literature. You read very little American literature. It wasn't taught. Because a lot of the professors thought, why waste your time with American literature? And that led to the hiring of the first two Americanists, or the first few Americanists, notably Perry Miller and F.O. Matheson, both at Harvard, and both major scholars. Louis Parrington and Henry Nash Smith were also not at Harvard, but major figures in the movement of American studies. They articulated a vision of America that had a degree of exceptionalism. And the exceptionalism was founded on a democratic ideal of the artisanal ideal, which really begins with Tocqueville. Tocqueville's Democracy in America describes, in the North, individuals who can work and receive the fruits of their own labor and become successful and essentially self-sufficient. This was long before the age of industrialization. That was seen as a thesis. And essentially it's a way of arguing that there was no feudal past. In my view, there was a profound feudal past in the slave states. That's now been increasingly discussed, but because of the way in which white Southerners gained control of the Civil War, slavery was cast from the end of the Civil War until about 10 years ago as a comparatively benevolent society. That enslaved people were part of a big family, downplaying the horrors and the inhumanity in different ways. And so there was a profound divide between North and South, and Tocqueville and Nash Smith and Parrington and Perry Miller. They focused, their vision of the United States really focused in the North. The other aspect, or another aspect, along with the notion that the United States did not have a feudal past, is the American spirituality. And it is true, based on the first polls or understandings of the degree of religiosity in the United States versus France or Britain or other countries, one of the ways that the United States is still unique as a nation is in its degree of religiosity. For throughout the 20th century, especially with the rise of industrialization and many other factors, the number of, and polls base it on the degree to which people say they believe in God or its equivalent, and the degree to which they attend religious services regularly. And in the United States, it's actually dropped considerably in the past 20 years. But for almost all of the 20th century and in the polls in the 19th century, over 85 to 90, and in some cases the mid 90% of Americans say they believe in God without doubting without doubting existence of God. And in Europe, those numbers were half that in some cases, but dramatically lower. And for most of the 20th century, the number of Americans saying that they attend church services or its equivalent was 50% or more. Those are very high numbers compared to European countries. And that was part of the exceptionalism in the United States. And part of that also was because of the separation of church and state that's in the Constitution. Because of the separation of church and state, ministers and the founders of churches had to compete in a marketplace. And by competing in a marketplace, they were competing against souls, so to speak. And so they were willing to revise their liturgy, revise the services in ways that accommodate the times. And that remains very different today from if you go to England or you go to Germany. I mean, most churches there, the church itself, the structure itself, the liturgies are very different, or not that different from when they were 100 years ago. In the United States, there's some brilliantly innovative forms of preaching and of bringing people into church and to God.
So we in this initial class have three tasks. Right? One is to introduce the subject matter,
Right.
and its interests, why it's enigmatic, why it's fertile. The second is to discuss the great theme of American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is completely different from every other country in the world. An idea which on its face seems absurd in some ways, but the question we will ask ourselves is, what is the salvageable remnant in this otherwise mysterious and preposterous idea of American exceptionalism? And the third theme is, what is the narrative which will guide us in our study, in our discussion over the semester? There have been a series of narratives, and we'll say a few things about them. Now, let me begin with the first subject, the subject of the study of the American national experience and the interest that it has for us. The study of the American national experience combining two main focal points: the institutional issues, political economy, the organization of the state and of government, but on the other hand, the study of consciousness. So the first challenge in the attempt to explore a national experience and a national project is to relate the institutional life and history of the country to its dominant forms of consciousness. And no one knows how to do that. This is one of the great problems now that we have in social and historical thought. The second challenge is how to understand the future in the light of the past and the past in the light of the future. So in any field of human knowledge, to understand a phenomenon is to understand how it can change. What are its transformative possibilities? Not ultimately the horizon of the ultimately possible, but in the domain of the adjacent possible. What are the theirs to which we can get from here? And no one understands anything in society or in nature unless they have a view of transformation. One of the difficulties of the contemporary social sciences is that each of them in its own way has severed the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible. And as a result of this severing of the link, they all end up in different ways, each in its own way, as a kind of retrospective rationalization. So the study of the national experience of the national project offers us an intellectual opportunity to rebel against that. Now, the third point to make is that the study of the national experience is a challenge because it is about something unique. Aristotle said, the individual is ineffable. What is not recurrent cannot be the object of study. But the study of a national experience is by its very nature the study of something singular. And so it's intellectually difficult. It's intellectually difficult. The way to do it is not clear. So in a place like Harvard University, a young American who wants to study his own country and have a view of its national possibilities, the meaning of its national experience, has no clear way in which to do that, except by studying a bunch of specialized disciplines and exploring how each of them interrogates the national experience. Now, I think that the main intellectual interest of this study is that it presents, for these reasons, a challenge to the mind and is incompatible with the social sciences as they're now organized. That is, any coherent, penetrating, powerful vision of the national experience and of the national project will, I would want to argue, be inevitably subversive of the methods of the social sciences. The conventional view is you study this, you study that, you study economics, you study political science, you study literary theory, and then somehow you apply it to the national experience. But the application of it to the national phenomenon would in fact subvert all of the disciplines that are being applied. So when you put everything together, you don't get a coherent picture, you get a complete dissonance. And that's the main subject of interest. So,
Can I just add something?
yes, of course.
So one of the distinctions between the social sciences and the sciences vis-a-vis the humanities is that the social sciences, whether at Harvard, history is in those social sciences, but most social sciences believe in what's called in a variety of ways a kind of objectivity ideal, meaning that each generation of scholarship gets closer and closer to the truth of what they're studying. And in studying American culture, that just does not hold.
Well, it doesn't hold in studying any culture.
Yes, or any culture,
Yeah.
any culture. But that's part of the beauty, in a sense, of approaching the social, scientific, and political topics from the perspective of American studies.
Yeah. And a practical example of the force of this enigma, this conundrum, is the difficulty we have in suggesting a reading, a book,
Right.
which engages the American experience. If we say this is what we want to do to interrogate the American experience, who has done it? So, according to the Americans generally now, the person who came close to doing it was a foreigner, a Frenchman,
Yes.
Tocqueville.
Yes. Yes.
And Tocqueville's book about the United States, to my mind, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the Americans. Tocqueville believed that the United States was the vanguard of democracies in the sense of being the vanguard of societies of the future who would value equality above all.
That's right.
And so it was the devotion to an egalitarian ideal which supposedly above all motivates the Americans.
Yes. Yes.
This isn't the country I see around me.
Yes.
And I think it's a misinterpretation of what's special about the United States. But it's also an example of the difficulty that we have in this project.
That's right.
Now, there's one point on which I want to place a special emphasis, and that is the relation between historical understanding, which is one of the main themes here in our arguments over the semester, and programmatic argument about the alternatives, about the future. And everyone would tend to agree that a programmatic argument, an argument about the alternatives, should be informed by an interpretation of the past. But what's most interesting is the opposite relation. That is, that your interpretation of the American experience now, and has been, as it has been in the past, is informed as well by an imagination of its possibilities. It's the opposite relation that is most intriguing. That it's our idea of what the country can become next, which especially motivates this argument about what it is now. And that, as I said, is true of all insight into all phenomena, natural or social. If you don't understand what something can become next, you don't understand it altogether. And then you just stare at it, or you retrospectively rationalize it, which is a large part of what the social sciences and humanities now do. This retrospective rationalization. And this is not something which is restricted to social study, it's also true of natural science.
That's right. That's right.
In the natural sciences, we don't understand any phenomenon unless we understand what its transformative possibilities are. And so, for that reason, over the semester, we won't rigidly divide historical argument from programmatic argument, but we'll go back and forth. We're not going to leave the programmatic arguments to the end. We're going to bring them to the front. Even today in the first class, later in our discussion of the narrative which should guide us. Now, shall we go on to American exceptionalism?
Yes.
Or?
Yes.
So let me begin that
Okay,
discussion.
and I'll pick it up.
Okay. So the discussion of American exceptionalism is what makes the United States different from other contemporary societies. And the claim that it is completely different has practical significance. So it has encouraged the Americans to see themselves as having an exemplary role in modern history and being the source of guidance for the other countries in the world. Even in a very practical sense, the United States has claimed ascendancy on the basis of this exemplary role that its leaders and thinkers imagine it to play in the world. even before it, way before it became a great power, at the end of the 19th century, the United States, for example, its statesmen, its leaders, organized its foreign policy on the basis of two principles, from which American statesmen have never varied later in American history. The first principle is that the United States should exercise uncontested hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. It should set the rules. It should determine who else can come in and who can't, and on what terms. The second principle is that the United States should not allow any other country in any other region of the world to consolidate a hegemony so incontestable in that region that it can then, on that basis, bid for universal hegemony. This is the second principle. And these two principles are, of course, principles which, by their very nature, no other country could ever arrogate to itself. And a large part of the justification for this hegemonic idea is the claim to have this exemplary status in the world, not just to be more powerful, but to be the source of the light. This is how the discourse of American exceptionalism gains practical power. So, what is it that makes the United States different? Now I'm going to present a thesis which regards all these aspects of American exceptionalism and is an attempt to deflate the conception, but at the same time rescue something from its pretenses. And the claim is that in a whole series of ways, in many different dimensions, the United States is exceptional, that it represents the extreme of something that is common among the advanced Western societies. So it's as if the dominant form of Islam were the Wahhabis, as if there were an extreme sect, and the extreme sect is representative of the total. And that's one way to interpret the pragmatic or realistic residue in the mysterious conception of American exceptionalism. Now, on what dimensions? So, first, in the rigidity of the class structure. In the extremity of the class structure. The United States has a class structure which is representative of the class structure of the advanced societies. It's not peculiar. At the top, there's an ultra-elite, super-rich plutocrats. Then beneath that, there's a professional business class, which is also an asset-holding class. Underneath that, there's a small business class, which has always punched above its weight in American history and has had an exemplary significance. Underneath the small business class, there is a working class with a white collar and a blue collar segment. People who have worked in factories or in shops, physically with their hands, and people who work in offices and manipulate things. And under that working class, there is a racially stigmatized underclass. Now, you will have noticed that in this nomenclature, I nowhere alluded to the conception of a middle class, because on this view, there is no middle class. The great majority of Americans don't have $500 on which they can draw in an emergency.
Plus a lot of very wealthy want to call themselves middle class.
They are workers, not necessarily workers who work with their hands, but workers who work in offices. And a Marxist would say middle class in the American terminology means a worker with a bourgeois identity. So that's the meaning of the term middle class. And so the American class hierarchy is very pronounced, but it's not exceptional at all. It is a variation of the dominant form of the class system in all these advanced, democratic, educated Western societies. But at the same time, the United States is the advanced Western country which is most inclined to deny the reality of class. So, for example, when there was the Depression, the collapse in the United States, Herbert Hoover ran for re-election, and in the speech in which he accepted the nomination of the Republican Party, he said, "We're not like the European societies. In our country, the individual rises and falls in a free medium of these atoms. There's no class structure in the United States." Now, in front of the building where he was speaking, people were lining up at soup kitchens because there had already been the economic collapse of that moment. So this belief that the United States is essentially classless is a belief sustained in the face of what might seem to be overwhelming empirical evidence to the contrary. So that combination of the rigidity of the class system and of the tenacity with which its existence is denied is the first notable form of the American exception, if you like.
Yes, that begins, I mean, Tocqueville articulated that.
Yeah.
Others did as well, early on.
Now, a second manifestation, and by the way, this denial of class has had some practical advantages for the United States, one might conjecture, because another respect in which the Americans have excelled is the ability to cooperate, both in peace and in war. And the pretense that they're not divided, that there isn't this class structure, seems to have been one of the enabling circumstances of the facility with which they cooperate. So that although the denial of the reality of class has been an impediment in the sense that it has prevented them from contending with one of the great forces in their democracy that pull it down or pull it apart, it has had the advantage of facilitating their accumulation of social capital, their ability to cooperate with one another. Now, second, as John suggested a moment ago, the United States is distinguished from the other advanced societies by the intensity of religious fervor. And as we will discuss next week, a distinction has to be made among three main currents of religious life in the United States. Harold Bloom wrote extensively about this. There are the organized and traditional forms of Christianity, Catholic and Protestant. There is the secular humanism, which is, to a very large extent, a secularization of Christian belief, an adaptation of it to the contemporary moral pieties. But third, there is what Bloom called the American religion, by which he meant the religions that the Americans invented, like Jehovah's Witnesses, Latter-day Saints, Seventh-day Adventists, even Southern Baptists. And this religion is, a Christian might say, a heretical form of Christianity, but a unique form, a form that has special contours. its central conception is that the individual doesn't, humanity is not simply an interaction with God, playing a role in God's redemptive plan. Humanity, the individual human being in a very real sense, is God, and participates in the eternal life of God. And this idea has a series of implications or corollaries, which a Christian might say are heretical. And they are the unique religious character of the United States, of the Americans. If Tocqueville had understood how central they were and how unique it was, he might not have said that the Americans are above all united by their egalitarianism, when in fact they're united by this religion, the American religion. Now,
which can be immensely empowering, as I suggested. So many Americans, unlike other countries, see God or the divinity as present, and whether or not in them, it's present and able to
incarnate and
embodied, and so that empowers the individual through faith to seek to transform and improve himself, herself, and society. And that's where it becomes, from a cultural perspective, hugely important, and it historically has been hugely powerful.
So Tocqueville had this the egalitarian idea, and as you and I have discussed in the past, the Americans adore Tocqueville.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why they adore him is that he flatters them.
Yes.
So, like everyone else in the world, they like to be flattered. And so the Tocquevillian treatment of the United States is an adulatory treatment. It's flattering. Saying, no, they're not these heretics of the interior life.
That's right.
They are egalitarian, showing the way for humanity. Now we come to a third characteristic of the American exception reinterpreted, and which is also not radically different from all the other Western societies. It's just an extreme form of something that is common in the advanced societies, and that is their institutional dogmatism. So their idea, let me now say it in an exaggerated form, so you see what I'm trying to suggest. The belief of the Americans is that at the time of the foundation of their republic, they discovered the definitive form of a free society. All the other societies in the world must either subscribe to this formula or continue to vegetate in poverty and despotism. They discovered the form of a free society. The form is manifest above all in the Constitution, and the cult of the Constitution is one of the unique features of the United States, of the American public religion. So
it was seen for a long time, after it was published and in the antebellum period, almost a sacred document.
yes, indeed, and by some literally sacred.
Yes, literally sacred.
So this has powerful implications. Every other country in the world has revised its constitutions multiple times. The Americans have treated the Constitution as an intrinsic part of their national identity.
They still do.
They still do. They still do. Napoleon Bonaparte said that a constitution should be brief and obscure, but The only nation that seems to have followed his advice is the United States. This cult of the Constitution has implications that are not always clear to the Americans. So an implication is that in the United States, the main way in which to remake the Constitution has been to reinterpret it rather than to change it. So in other countries, the Constitution is changed, it's rewritten. Thomas Jefferson, one of the revered founders, argued that the Constitution should be trashed every 2 generations so that the living would not be ruled by the dead. But his advice has not been followed and not even heard. The Constitution is a sacrosanct document. That means that the way to change it, to amend it, is not overtly to amend it, but to pretend that it means something different from what it used to mean. And of course, that has implications for the content, because what it means is that the focus of constitutional revision is pushed onto the reinterpretation of rights, like due process and equal protection, and away from the structure of the democracy. Because after all, it's easy to pretend, or relatively easy, that equal protection means one thing rather than another thing. But how can you pretend that the Constitution says that there should be 7 branches of government when it appears to say that there should be 3? So this preference to revise the Constitution by reinterpreting it rather than by overtly amending it has significant implications for American democracy. Now, many American thinkers, many great American thinkers, from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, have tried to convince their fellow citizens to revise institutions. So, a characteristic of American culture is a pervasive experimentalism. Experiment with everything in order to progress. Experimentation is the doorway to progress. And the American philosophy, the characteristic American philosophical school, pragmatism, is a theory of experimentalism. But the Americans have accorded to their institutions, to their political institutions and their cultural institutions, an exemption from the otherwise overwhelming force of this experimentalist impulse. And this is astonishing, this exemption. So they say, we should experiment with everything except our institutions. The cult of the Constitution is simply the extreme form of that. But the same applies to the basic legal and institutional architecture of the market economy. And
even though they themselves are continually experimenting.
Yes.
You see that in terms of...
And trying to conceal that they are, or
That's
denying
right.
that they are.
Yeah, but just the fact that, you know, the number, the average American, how many different homes and states does he or she live in the United States vis-a-vis Europe? The difference is massive. That's one of numerous examples of personally embracing the experimentalism, but not the nation state.
So we've spoken about religion, inequality in the class system, religion, and the reification of institutions, institutional dogmatism, the idea that a free society has a singular and natural form most notably with respect to democracy, to politics, but also with respect to the economy, to the market. Now I want to speak about one final element. Of course, this is an open list. I'm just giving examples, trying to hack the idea of American exceptionalism down and to rescue the realistic residue from the mystical shell. And this fourth has to do with the style of sociability, of consciousness. And it's a general problem, as are all the others of which I've spoken. They all are about the fate of modern society, contemporary societies. I can introduce it by referring to a remark of Schopenhauer's, Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, about the situation of humanity. So it says, humanity, we're like porcupines in the cold night.
That's right.
To warm one another,
Yes,
we
that's
come together, and then we prick one another with this. The porcupines prick one another with a sponge, and then they move apart, and then they get cold, and then they move together again, and they're all the time moving restlessly back and forth, seeking for this imaginary middle distance.
Well, being great.
So that's one description of the problem that I'm trying to evoke. Another description was given by Madame de Staël at the beginning of the 19th century, when she prophesied the emergence of societies that would be prodigal in meetings that deprive us of solitude without affording us company. The same basic idea of Schopenhauer's porcupines. And what is then the generic problem to which these comments go? They go to a problem which is different from the two problems that have been the dominant concern of social thought. The two problems that have been the dominant concern have been subjugation or oppression and disunion, or conversely, emancipation and union.
Emancipation, union,
So
disunion.
it's a third problem, which is not an active subject in modern social thought, but which is a great subject inherently, and that is the problem of coldness. So in these societies of the past, the slave society is the extreme. The idea is that every social relation should combine in itself three elements: exchange, power, and affect. The relation between the man and the woman, the boss and the underling, the ruler and the governed, should be an exchange, which is hierarchical, an instrument of power, but is sentimentalized. The formula of social life should be the sentimentalization of unequal exchange. That was the ideology of slavery, the extreme form. We're one big happy family. These elements are brought together. These modern liberal societies demand the disassociation of these three elements and their allocation to separate domains of social life. Exchange to the market, power to politics, and affect to the family or to private life. And when this dissociation takes place, there is disenchantment or coldness. That's the world in which we lose this affect. Talleyrand said, those who did not live before the revolution do not know the sweetness of life. This is another way of alluding to this idea that this oppressive world was also a world full of affect. And the affect was mixed with the oppression. So in that world, this liberalized world, of the world of the porcupines, the world of the meetings that deprive us of solitude without affording us company, the moderns, and especially the Americans, I'm claiming to maintain the logic of my argument, have to develop a form of sociability, which I could describe as a cheerful, impersonal friendliness. That is the characteristic social posture of the Americans. In the United States, they walk around the street smiling often. In many
Depends
countries,
on what region it
Yes.
is. It's far less smiling in New England than
Yes,
there is in
that's
Midwest
true.
or.
and in many countries in the world, smiling without having a clear reason for it is regarded as a sign of madness.
Yes.
So there's this form of sociability, which is, I just call it a cheerful and personal friendliness, a distant benevolence combined with an inner aloofness. This is how a cultural anthropologist might describe this social world.
Yes, yeah, that would be more New England
Yeah.
than the Midwest.
And that also is just an exaggeration. It's something which is common in the modern society. So that's my thesis. My thesis is that the way in which we can preserve the category of American exceptionalism is to think of the country as being exceptional in the sense that it is this extreme or relative extreme version of attributes that are widely diffused in the advanced societies, but which taken together in their convergent effect allow the Americans to have this sense of specialness, which encourages them in the performance of the role, which is either exemplary in one vocabulary, or hegemonic and imperialistic in another.
Subtle or masked imperialism.
Your comments?
Yeah, I want to actually, we've been talking a lot. I want some questions or comments from you all, and then I will provide some of my own. Questions? Yes.
So, Professor, what you were saying on your point about American kindness, there.
Could you put your microphone on?
Sorry?
Your microphone. You press it. It's in front of you, there's a microphone.
Okay, hello.
There you go.
Okay,
There
so
you go.
in your
You have to keep pressing it as you say.
this is new for me. So in your description
One on
of
this side too.
oh, it's further away.
Okay.
You were saying that there are 3 characteristics of cultural engagements within American society. So the first one was exchange, and the second one was power. What was the third?
No, what I was saying is that in many societies in world history, the characteristic formula of social relations is a combination of exchange, power, and allegiance or affect. So that, for example, in the relation between the boss and the underling, or the master and the slave, clearly there's an exchange. The exchange is an instrument of power, and it has an overlay of affect or allegiance. So that's where these societies get their warmth from. The warmth is, as it were, an extrapolation of family affect. And then one might ask the question, well, where then should a modern liberal society get its warmth from? If it can't get it from family affect. The Neo-Confucianist formula, the modernized Confucianism deployed in China, might try to get it from the old way. That is, through some diffusion of family affect. What's the alternative? There is no alternative yet. So that's this middle distance, this aloofness, softened or sugar-coated by the benevolent cheerfulness in the relations among people. I would say there is another way in which the heat can be generated. The heat can be generated by the imagination. The imagination is the other great source of heat. The political and economic institutions can be made instruments of the imagination, and we'll have that discussion later. The imagination is a superior form of heat to family affect, but it's radically different, and it requires a series of institutional experiments in the organization of the economy and the organization of the democracy, which of course are incompatible with any form of institutional dogmatism.
Did you want to add to that?
That question, no, different
Go ahead.
one. Okay.
You talked a lot about religion, and I'm just wondering what role the founders' notion that they were a chosen nation plays in the United States distinguishing itself from other civil societies, especially because religion seems to be at the heart of the United States. So I know that the founders believed, or at least some of them believed, that we are a chosen nation, and that played a huge role and still does today in terms of American exceptionalism, and has in many ways also led to the American civil religion. So I'm just wondering how those things also overlay.
Yeah, how American, from its founding, saw itself as part of a civil religion, and how that plays out over the years, over the centuries. Is that correct?
And as a chosen nation.
As a chosen
Yeah.
nation, yeah. As Americans are, the United States and the American society was essentially founded by God, or God had a major hand in it, so that the Americans are exceptional. They're exceptional because it was a chosen nation by God, which is one of the, it manifests itself in multiple ways, one of which is among developed nations, the number of Americans who are even interested in visiting another country is basically like the night and day versus every other major country. Most Americans do not even have a passport. Most Americans have never left the United States. I think that's still the case.
And some presidents.
And some presidents. So that's one example, so that they see themselves, they conceptualize themselves and the nation as a kind of bubble that's bestowed by God or Christ or whoever your Redeemer is. And
But this is a completely novel conception of chosenness, right? This wasn't the conception of the Jews, for example.
no, not at all. But that it is in a sense you could say that it's part of the exceptional nature of the United States. That and part of it is the Constitution, the separation of church and state, which has fueled this understanding over the years. I think that's a very good.
A long line of American thinkers, going back to this theme of dogmatism, from Thomas Jefferson to John Dewey, tried to persuade their fellow citizens to revoke this exemption that they accorded to the institutions from the reach of the experimentalist impulse. And they failed. So it's not that this was accepted by everyone. Many of the American thinkers rejected this idea. But I think it has to be said that on the whole, they didn't succeed. Yes.
So on the framework that you guys started with about, focusing on how the programs we have for the future inform the way that we view the past, how exactly do we come up with these programs? Are they a spontaneous creation of our imaginations, or are they more, I think, logically a product of our historical experience themselves? So in other words, when we think about what the future should be, we can only come up with that thought by the processes that have formed us, which are past and historical, and our view of history itself. So do you view the sort of argument, do you view it as circular, or do you think that our ability to conceive of a future is some spontaneous gift that we receive in our imaginations, wholly separate and independent of the past?
No, I think that inevitably, much of the justification of a programmatic idea about an alternative, has to come internally. That is, there's a dialectic of ideals and their instantiation, examples of them. And so then we think the existing arrangements fail to realize the ideals. We tinker with the arrangements, and then our tinkering in turn helps reveal to us ambiguities in our understanding of our interests and ideals, which were previously hidden to us. That's a large part of normative argument. And our interests and our ideals are always nailed to the cross of the arrangements and the institutions that represent them in fact. And the law is the site of this crucifixion. It's the place where our ideals and interests meet our institutions and practices. And there's this contradiction which is constantly arising between how we understand our ideals and what our institutions and practices are. But that's not the whole of normative argument. That's the internal part, as it were. But there's clearly something else. There's a visionary or prophetic element, which is an attempt to transcend that internal argument, motivated by some conception of human possibility, not just of national history. And that's also a part of it.
Just to pick up on that for a second, that the notion of national history has had considerable power. I mean, Orwell's 1984 is very resonant today when Orwell famously said, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the future controls the present." So how one has understood the past has had considerable influence on policies and perceptions today. And in fact, I wanted Roberto, what you mentioned between the relationship of exchange and power and allegiance.
Allegiance or affect.
And particularly in terms of exchange and power, that power, there's a long history in the United States in which especially that both exchange, power, and allegiance has manifested itself in a kind of warfare or war, especially in terms of slavery. The basic definition of slavery is that it's a state of war. because enslaving another person can only occur through violence or the threat of violence. So war is foundational. That is also a part of power and exchange. And then there's also an aspect of allegiance within slavery, and in the sense that one is chattel, one is owned by someone else. That's a tangent, but yes, in fact.
How does the concept of settler colonialism,
Pardon me?
how does the concept of settler colonialism and indigenous land theft factor into American exceptionalism? Like in dealing with these concepts, like recognizing it's a term that's probably increasingly emerged in its use and retelling of history in the past few decades, particularly by indigenous scholars, and kind of shifting from this idea of like discovery of like a vacant continent and frontier to one of like encounter with existing inhabitants. So I'm curious about how this shifts this idea of exceptionalism.
I actually, could you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just asking about the concept of settler colonialism.
Of settler
And
what?
Settler colonialism.
Oh, right, settler colonialism, okay.
Yep.
I mean, so that's another aspect of, it's a very good question, of settler colonialism that reflects what Roberto described as the, in a sense of this understanding of America, and that settler colonialism was a way of essentially taking over indigenous lands in a way without feeling guilt, bringing the United States into, or bringing parts of the United States, or transforming it, making it part of the nation, and calling people who had been there for hundreds of years not part of the nation, or in some senses not worthy. And settler colonialism is, that's what we didn't mention. That's a very, very good point. That both reflects this vision of America in a way that is truly profound. So, would you like to?
I actually think we're going to come to a discussion of settler colonialism when we discuss these narratives
Yeah, that's
in
true.
the third part of our class. Sir, you had something? Yes.
I want to go back to the points you were making about institutional government. And that, to me, suggests some sort of reverence for what the Founding Fathers put together.
Reverence for what?
Reverence for the original institutions that the Founding Fathers conceived of and put in place. And you did talk about, although we certainly have change, we have reinterpretation, but could it be not so much that it's dogmatism as it's the curse that we live under with the Article 5 and the bar that the founders put in terms of amending the Constitution?
How so? What do you mean?
That it hasn't been for a lack of effort to try to change the Constitution, because there have been many, particularly on
Well,
certain.
they made it hard, very hard to change. So they deliberately made it very hard to change. So, and that's also an instance of a more general thing. So,
And one of the reasons they made it hard to change is because of slavery. That's really why they made it hard to change, because, I mean, was it South Carolinians in the Constitutional Convention were ready to walk out unless they had protections for slavery. And so there was this great fear because of the understanding of At that time, slavery in the South was far different. In the North, it was part of the Northern emancipation movement. So there's this profound tension, and I think that's a major part of it. It's a great question.
But clearly, the theme of institutional dogmatism has much broader roots than that.
Yes.
So-
yes. You can dogmatism.
Put aside the Constitution, think of the organization of the market economy. So the dominant, the theory of economics is a result of the marginalist revolution at the end of the 19th century. And in orthodox economics, there's no institutional prescription. The theory of economics is compatible with any institutional order. It's institutionally vacuous. It's deliberately vacuous. It has no institutional presuppositions about how a market should be organized. In fact, in the middle of the 20th century, it was established, I think, unequivocally, that the analytical apparatus of marginalist economics could be even applied to command economies. In other words, it has no institutional presuppositions. But the practical economist, speaking in the United States, thinks a market is a market, contract is contract, and property is property, as if they were natural things and there was a whole logic of these things. When the whole dominant line of legal thought in the last 150 years has been to demolish that proposition. And the people who demolished it weren't leftists, they weren't radicals. They were people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, the concrete legal and institutional architecture of the market cannot be deduced, cannot be inferred from abstractions like freedom of contract or private property. They turn on a series of particular conflicts among interests and visions, conflicts among interests and conflicts among visions. You can't resolve those conflicts by referring back to the abstractions. Nevertheless, the economist says differently. So this has enormous force. The attempt to take the institutions, the economic and political architecture of the country, and say they're just given, they're the nature of things. The extreme form of that is market fundamentalism in economics. And market fundamentalism, like in Hayek's theory, is the idea, I was speaking about this the other day in another class. If Robinson Crusoe trades long enough on his island, he will eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law. Why? Because implicit in spontaneous coordination is this whole institutional thing. All of that is preposterous. That's totally false. And if anything was demonstrated in the evolution of contemporary thought, including legal thought, it's a falsehood of that idea. But it goes on. So these institutional presuppositions have immense tenacity.
I'm interested in going back, I guess, and talking a little bit about the notion of America as a God-chosen nation. And, a lot of the framers and the intellectual thinkers were deists, which is important, I think, because they didn't believe in a God of history. They believed, my understanding is they didn't believe in a God who interfered in history. And I guess, in part, that raises the question of how can a God that doesn't interfere in history choose a nation or favor a nation? My understanding kind of is that they view it as a nation under God in the sense of under an idea, which is different than the European peerage system of being under men. But I guess I'm a little curious if you could elaborate on the God that you conceive of when you talk about America being understood as a nation, the God-chosen nation.
That's a great question. I mean, the deist perspective, you're absolutely right at the founding, but that can be that deism can be interpreted in multiple ways over time, so that God is distant, and he at some points a deist would say God can't help that God is distant, but at other points, if you're at war, that
God is
God
replaced by reason.
Yes. It's a combination of both, of trying to unite reason and faith. Reason and faith in the supernatural. And so that deism can play multiple roles from a cultural and political perspective, despite how it's understood from a religious perspective. If that
Like
makes sense.
Thomas Jefferson doing an edit of the Bible
Yes,
that left all of
yes.
the mysterious, magical parts out.
Yes. No, but I mean, the founders, you're right, they were not, they were more deists. Most of them were not that religious, although they did say they believed in God, but they used their deism in multiple ways, and especially in some cases after the war, in battle, there was a fairly considerable amount of bringing God closer to help achieve a victory, and you see that in some of the songs and some of the writings at the time.
But the question is the following, John. So there was in the late 18th century and early 19th century, there were a convergence of factors that this institutionalizing a certain kind of politics, which I would describe as a proto-democratic liberalism. That was the regime instituted in the Constitution. And a large part of the objective of the framers was to inhibit or contain the dangers of politics and protect the free order from the ravages of demagogic or despotic politics, right? And so the people participate, but not too much.
That's right.
And they're led by this natural elite. Huh? And you try and create a kind of politics that prevents anything too serious from happening. So, for example, one of the characteristics of the Madisonian scheme, of the constitutional scheme, is to create a kind of table of correspondences between the transformative ambition of a political project and the severity of the constitutional obstacles which it has to overcome in order to be implemented. So, impasse, especially between the president and the Congress when it occurs, rather than being quickly resolved, is perpetuated. So the perpetuation of impasse is not regarded as a cost. It's an advantage. So long as the order that prevails is the right order, the right private order, a large part of the objective is to safeguard it against politics. Huh? And so if we can create recurrent impasse, so much the better. Huh? So that's one element. This politics, which is, I'm calling it proto-democratic and anti-popular. Then a second element is a particular version of Christianity, of the inner consciousness, the privatization of the sublime. And so that no great waves of religious enthusiasm will sweep over the economic and political order. That came later, in the 1830s and so forth. Then the fourth element is the reification of the private order. Private property, a particular, and after all, private property was an invention of the 19th century. In the history of law, the normal form of property is to be disaggregated. It has component powers, and these powers were vested in different tiers of right holders. The unification of these powers in a single power vested in a single right holder, the owner, is an anomaly in the history of law. But that's what was in fact the linchpin of this order established in the United States. So you have a series of constitutional or political, religious, and economic inventions that converge to the creation of this world, which is supposed to be like a perpetual motion machine. It's supposed to act constantly. There are provisions for revision in extreme situations, but the main objective is to safeguard it against the storm, right?
So I had one clarifying question and then one actual question. But for the separation of church and state, I just wanted to clarify, would it be an effective or correct generalization to say that basically because we separated church and state, it opened the door for this American particular religion and ideology and potentially for market forces to almost become sacred and for the Constitution to almost become sacred? Like, would that be a somewhat correct generalization?
Yeah, the separation, I mean, to a degree, the separation of church and state liberated citizens, liberated people to articulate his or her own relationship with God and the church in ways that really hadn't occurred before. And so very quickly, I mean, the number of different religions, and there was also an economic aspect to it. Churches cropped up very quickly, and so it was in both then and now it's a market, a competitive marketplace. And so it's one of the ways in which that's manifested is that if I want to create a church and I want to be the minister of that church, I have to be very sensitive to what to changes over time, because if the liturgy and the liturgy and the framework of the church doesn't change with cultural change, I'm going to lose my flock. So that it has created this profoundly vibrant religious society in the sense that, as I mentioned, the United States as a very developed nation is unique in world history in the ongoing degree of Americans who believe in God and do not doubt the existence of God. And many of them believe that God affects their lives on a regular basis and the lives of society. Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask the other question too? Thank you so much.
So John, let's go to the third part of our planned discussion for today.
Okay.
And I want to ask you about these guiding narratives of the study, for the study of the United States. I would say now that, caricaturing, I would say, a common narrative now is that the central problem in American history is the unfinished business of the Civil War, the aftermath of slavery. And then all of American history is read in that narrative as a long wind-up, a long accession to the civil rights legislation of the late 20th century. So that would be one narrative. Then another narrative would be the one organized around the Turner hypothesis, right? The frontier hypothesis. It's the openness, it's the westward expansion of the United States, its openness the abundance of resources and of land, which is the decisive element in American history. A third element would be the Louis Hart's idea that the United States was a liberal society that was born without a feudal past, as it sprung full-blown from the womb.
Yes.
And so there are these narratives. So I want to first hear you about these narratives.
And yeah,
But second, I want you to ask what your view is of what our narratives should be.
And what's the first one again? What was the first narrative?
Well, I think the first narrative really has to be the Tocqueville narrative. That there's a democratic transformation in the whole world.
Yes. So
that the United States is in the vanguard of this democratic transformation. And democracy understood as focused mainly on equality.
Yes,
that was the Tocquevillian narrative.
Yeah. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Tocqueville really, he highlights that the uniqueness of the United States in terms of its equality, and that he sees, you know, each person having autonomy over his life, and he articulates a classical, what scholars have referred to as an artisanal narrative. No matter, I mean, he's really framing it from the context of the free North, in which there's a lot of excess land. The soil is it's extremely rich soil. Most Americans are farmers, but they can also be blacksmiths or coopers or dressmakers. And it was both men and women who participated in this artisanal economy. Tocqueville was uncomfortable discussing the South. He discusses slavery a bit, but most of his articulation of the United States is of the free states, not of the slave states. So I think that's one important way of understanding Tocqueville. The frontier thesis has been hugely popular from the 19th into the 20th century, and it reflects, so the frontier thesis is seen as a democratic thesis that despite the number of immigrants coming, that everyone can fulfill or be part of this successful artisanal ideal where you receive the fruits of your own labor as a family or as a cooper, blacksmith, etc. We now know that the main advocates for the frontier thesis were not those embracing artisanal work. It was Southerners who wanted more land for slavery. That's really the foundation of the frontier thesis, of expanding, whether it's taking Mexico, making war against Mexico that increases the size of the United States by a third, and
what about the one with which I began, which is that the guiding thread in the study of the American national experience should be the study of the unfinished business of the Civil War.
Right, which is, yes, that's exactly right. It's the unfinished business of the Civil War that the frontier thesis is, in a sense, part of. And what's also ironic is the idea of the United States not having a feudal past. I mean, it's both in the antebellum period. I mean, every anti-slavery advocate and abolitionist, black or white, recognized the feudal nature of the American South. The American South, the feudalism was inherent and obvious and ingrained within the society. And many Southerners themselves celebrated this feudal past. They look back to Rome, they look back to Greece. In fact, after the Civil War, as a way of retaining their identity as Southerners, they themselves learned ancient Greek, and they became fluent in the ancient languages, and that was part of their identities as Southerners you know, and as part of unofficially recognizing the power, the significance of a feudal past, where there's a rigid hierarchy, and there are lords at the top, and then those that there for any society to be successful, you need people doing the dirty work.
So let me make a suggestion here in the spirit of exploring where the study of the United States joins engagement with the general situation of humanity in the world. And that goes to your emphasis at several points in today's class on the artisanal economy in the North.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, in many respects, you could say that there was an artisanal economy in the South, but the enslaved people were forced.
So
to
the
create.
reference to this artisanal economy has a clear empirical basis. When Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, only 1 in 5 white men worked for another white man. That is an astonishing fact. It means that there was a whole society in the North, which was essentially centered on these small-scale proprietors or entrepreneurs who arranged things among themselves. There was an elite that watched over them, and that certainly didn't want them to rebel against the elite, and hoped to achieve some accommodation through the constitutional arrangements that were made at the time of the foundation of the Republic. So, it escalates into the 1850s. So a great quote I'll just share is that Lincoln, in his debates with Stephen Douglas when he first became a national figure, he said that he's articulating the artisan ideal beautifully. He says, "I believe that every man and woman should be able to receive the fruits of his or her own labor." And that's both men and women, and he said including black women. and Lincoln in his speech to the Wisconsin Agricultural Society
Yes.
also develops this thing, wage labor is unnatural.
Yes.
No one would deliberately
Exactly.
choose to be a wage laborer.
And he continued to say that through his presidency. He was aware, in other words, of industrialization, but recognized its bane.
So here's the conjecture that I wanted to propose as a point of departure, beginning with the world, not with the United States. In the world today, most people are poor and disorganized. However, their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. So what do most people in the world want? What they want is to have a little farm, a little store in town, a trade for which they can charge a fee, and so forth. That's the aspiration of most of humanity. The industrial labor force, the organized labor force, headquartered in the capital-intensive sectors of the economy, which in the past 100 years, the left-leaning parties took as their core constituency, are increasingly a small minority, which increasingly comes to be seen by the rest of society as just one more interest group, and ultimately sees itself that way, rather than as what Marx hoped they would be, which is the bearer of the universal interests of humanity. So what is the universal? What is the common state of humanity? It's this would-be petty bourgeoisie, we might call it the subjective petty bourgeoisie, because in the world, most of them are not actually in some small business class, but they want to be. And so it is these poor people with petty bourgeois aspirations who are the mass of humanity now.
Yes, who are clinging to this artisanal ideal
Yeah.
in a world that's
Now,
not just
now,
industrialized.
now we go back to the discussion of the United States. So in the United States, in the first half of the 19th century, in the period between the foundation and the Civil War, in the North, there was this world of petty proprietorship, petty entrepreneurship, artisans, small-scale proprietors. Today they might call them a property-owning democracy. And
For men and women.
yes, and this world was destroyed after the Civil War. So the Southern economy, the slave regime was destroyed, but the Northern regime was also destroyed. And it wasn't rescued. So it was destroyed because the defenders of cooperation, of small-scale initiative, never discovered a way to reconcile radical economic decentralization and small scale with aggregation to scale and of scope, demanded by a complex, modern, innovative economy. That's the problem that remained unsolved from the 19th century in all of the Western societies. And the Americans allowed this ideal world of petty proprietorship, a petty artisan majority, to sink, to perish, together with its economic institutions. They failed to rescue this model of social life from its body, from its institutional body. And that's a problem faced in different ways by the whole world. So I think that should be the guiding narrative.
I completely
Rather than take the guiding narrative in our course as the unfinished business of the Civil War, and how to take the next step after the civil rights legislation, to take it as this. Because it turns out now that mass production in this conventional industry, which everyone thought was the wave of the future, is now a tangent. Most workers are disorganized. Unionization, for example, doesn't survive outside of government employment or the third sector. And conventional industry is being replaced by an insular form of the knowledge economy. In that world, in the world that is arising, the question of how that earlier ideal can be reinvented and adapted to the new economic requirements acquires immense practical importance. And that's the point at which this study of the past could converge with the imagination of the alternative futures. And by engaging the American experience in that direction, we join it to the fate of the rest of humanity, rather than treating it as something which is the exception to everything else. So that's the argument.
Danger of exceptionalism. Yeah, no, that's very good. I mean, one way to summarize the effect of the Civil War is that essentially corporations replace artisans, and corporations replace
Yes.
artisans, and it begins during the war as.
And then eventually, the national government simply facilitates the deals between big business
Yes.
and high finance, and the bystander. The petty bourgeoisie are relegated to their archaic world of small business. So in the contemporary world now, returning from the discussion of the United States to the discussion of the world, where is the forward impulse? What would be necessary for there to be growth miracles in the rest of the world, beyond the fringe of East Asia, China, and the tiger economies? In most countries, the elites have to help, right? There has to be, no project is going to work unless it has participation of the elites. In most countries, the predominant element in the elites is financial. in most countries, they are financial rentiers or natural resource rentiers of one kind or another. So there has to be a division in the national elite between the rentier majority and a productivist counter-elite. A counter-elite that places production above finance and that seeks power and wins power with the support of this subjective petty bourgeoisie, and then offers the subjective petty bourgeoisie an alternative to its regressive, relatively unproductive ideal of archaic, isolated family business, right? It's not a good solution for that majority, and it's not a threshold through which the nation can achieve a productivist growth story. Huh? So, now, the way in which the American experience converges with that is that now in the United States, similarly, there's no productivist project. The majority seems to be now mainly divided into two parts. There is a part which is credentialed educationally, which then becomes service providers around the vanguard, right? So the vanguard is an insular vanguard, and around it there's a mass of lawyers and accountants and tax people, paper pushers of different kinds. More than half of the graduating class of Harvard College. That's that world. And the rest, the other part of the mass are uncredentialed, and they're stuck in the back, right? In this,
Right. And many of them are aspiring to this old artisanal ideal.
and are easily manipulated,
Easily manipulated.
easily aroused, manipulated by plutocratic
By-
populace.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So that's the American form of this universal predicament. So I think that's more promising, because rather than taking the ideological and institutional presuppositions of the recent past, we discover what's the new world that is emerging. And in what way does the fate of the Americans converge with the fate of the rest of the world? That's better.
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question. I'm having trouble understanding what you mean by productivist use of the resources of the elite, because when you say
Can you
that,
speak up a little bit?
yeah. I'm having trouble understanding, or what you meant by
Productivist?
how do we use our resources to be productive?
So productivist means having a growth project that adds value, adding value rather than being parasitic on the existing productive apparatus. So finance, for example, can be more or less parasitic. It can serve production more or less. And if we were to discuss this now, it would lead us in other directions. Huh? But I think what you could say is that there are several enigmas about the place of finance in the economy. This goes to the question of what's productivist and what's the line between productivism and parasitic rentiers. So in general, the principle would be the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. And
And can you elaborate in what ways
So,
make it more useful?
So now the production system in these advanced economies is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. The vast preponderance of the funding of production is generated within the production system itself. That can then lead to a simple, disquieting question. What is the point of all of that money, of all of that liquid capital in the banks and the stock markets? Most of it is expended in trading of assets rather than any investment in production. And the activity, the financial activity that in principle would be most important, most useful, which is the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, in fact occupies an infinitesimal portion of financial activity. Even in those countries in which venture capital and its equivalents are most established, most organized, like the United States or Israel. So finance should be enlisted in the service of production. And the problem is not the speculative element in finance, because financial speculation can be useful in developing information and organizing the allocation of risk. The problem lies in the disassociation of the speculative element in finance from production. That's the nature of the argument. And
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for now, yeah, thank you.
There are other hands. Yeah, go ahead. Then,
How am I meant to be imagining assets when you say funding of the creation of new assets? What is an asset in that context?
what is
When you said just now the funding that is being generated by finance,
the
new
That's
assets.
what venture capital does, right?
But-
The existing productive apparatus is primarily exhausted in reproducing and developing what it already does. The large businesses don't go to the capital markets to borrow money. They go to earn money by financial operations for the most part. The venture capital activity or its equivalence is financing something new, startups. And that's what I said is an infinitesimal part of financial activity. Now, that's looking at the problem from the side of finance. If we look at it from the side of production, the problem is that the most advanced practice of production now is what we call the knowledge economy. And it is an insular, socially exclusive vanguard. It excludes the vast majority of firms and of workers in the country. So at the limit, the risk is that there will be this vanguard. The vanguard discovers a way to divide the process of production into two parts. The creative and lucrative part it keeps for itself, and the commoditized or routinized part it subcontracts to workers in firms in other parts of the world. So rather than spreading and becoming more general, the opposite happens. It becomes hyper-insular, more and more withdrawn into its core. So on the one hand, finance is disassociated from production, and on the other hand, the vanguard of production becomes insular, and the insularity has momentous consequences. On the one hand, for economic slowdown. How could there not be slowdown if the most advanced practice is denied to the largest part of the labor force, and to most firms? And on the other hand, to the aggravation of inequality. Inequality is anchored in the structural divisions of the production system. So that's the world. Now, in that world, this 19th century ideal of an economy of small proprietors and entrepreneurs has great attraction. An attraction in the whole world. If some ways can be found to reconcile the imperative of economies of scale and scope with this radical economic deconcentration. And now let me pause for an analytical reflection on the concept of the market. The market is supposed to be a coherent thing, right? And say it's property and contract and so forth. But even at the most abstract level, there are at least two dimensions in the idea of a market. One dimension is the absolute degree of decentralization. That is, the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The other dimension is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents has over the resources at his command. The conventional idea is that these two dimensions go together, naturally and necessarily. Absolute decentralization and absolute control. But the truth is that they contradict each other, because obviously one way to radicalize economic decentralization is to relativize the degree of control or the time of the control that each of those agents has over the resources. So then you can invent other forms of the market order that are hospitable to the combination of cooperation and competition, and that combine decentralization with the ability to aggregate resources without needing a single owner as the aggregator of the resources. So that projects the Americans then, thinking of the United States as the agent, into this world of experimentation. Experimentation in this case with the forms of the market. So in other words, in order to engage in an operation like this one, they have to say, we want the substance, but not the body. The body descends into the grave. The particular form of 19th century petty proprietorship and petty command. But the spirit has to be preserved. But it can only be preserved if we reinvent its institutional form. That's the kind of argument which I'm foreshadowing in these preliminary remarks.
And how to create, how to implement, and how it can remain vibrant. Yeah, that's very good. There was another hand up, and yeah, go ahead.
I'm interested in the influence that American exceptionalism has on American foreign policy, and I'm wondering what you think is the influence of this ideology on America's relationship with China, and whether the hostility between America and China is purely driven by economic considerations, or whether there's an ideological, social, cultural component to the hostility that's present, and if so, whether it's possible then to imagine a good relationship between the United States and China.
Well, there's something very tangible at the start, right? If I'm correct in what I claimed were the two principles of American foreign policy, from the outset, I said the second principle was the United States cannot allow any regional power to acquire in that region of the world, in its region, a hegemony so uncontested that then on that basis it can bid for universal hegemony. So the United States, for example, must align Japan, India, and Australia, New Zealand, to press China, so that China cannot seek what a great power would naturally seek, which is hegemony in its own region. That's the basis for war. That's a direct answer to your question.
Saw another hand up. Yes.
Wouldn't a better way to characterize the counter elites push for production instead of production over finance? Wouldn't a better way to characterize that be production over consumption, especially post World War II and how we've oriented our economy focusing on consumption?
Yes.
Wouldn't a better way to characterize this over finance?
Of course. So the situation in the world for a long time in the North Atlantic region has been that the right has something of a productivist project, minimally at least. But the left has only had a distributivist project or a redistributivist project. So, and this is a losing position in politics, right? Because in national political life, whichever force most credibly represents the cause of creation, of construction, of innovation, of energy, controls the agenda. So the position of the progressives is the progressives appear on the stage of contemporary history as the humanizers of the inevitable. What's their project? Their project is the sugarcoating of the project of their conservative adversaries. That's defeat.
I don't think it's a losing petition. I think if we potentially center our economy around production and around specifically work, I think that's a very compelling case, especially in today's environment. I also want to make note that Professor Stauffer mentioned that the remnants of the Civil War is still not, we may still be dealing with remnants of the Civil War. And actually, I would characterize our agricultural South as remnants of the Civil War. It's the only labor group that's actually not included in the National Labor Act. And you see huge